I'm going to hand over now to David from Fossil Free South Africa. David, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David LePage. I'm the coordinator of Fossil Free South Africa, as you've heard. Thanks very much for joining us today. It's great to have so many people in this meeting, and we hope that you'll find it interesting and worthwhile use of your time. A brief introduction to Fossil Free South Africa. We're a campaign for fossil fuel divestment. We've been going for 9 years. Our work really grew out of a campaign to persuade the University of Cape Town to commit to divestment, which they did in March this year. We also have an Invest Fossil Free campaign targeting SA's top asset managers, asking them to offer their clients fossil fuel-free funds. We have an exciting new program, Clean Creatives SA, which is asking ad and PR people to pledge not to work for the fossil fuel industry anymore. In other words, not to participate in the great greenwashing exercise. And now we're introducing this climate reporting guide, which is an effort to make a positive contribution to what has sometimes been quite a critical voice against media. So we're not going to go into in-depth on sources and references and so forth, but we have all those sources and references if you need them, and we're very happy to share them. So please don't hesitate to ask. And many of the references for the presentation I'm making now are in the guide. So this is a picture of a landslide, and I'm really using it as a way of introducing the predicament that we're in. A landslide, you throw a boulder down a mountain, and sometimes that boulder doesn't knock anything else out of the way and it just bounces away fairly harmlessly. But other times you throw a rock down a mountain and it starts off a whole lot of other rocks and causes a whole lot of mounting problems. And I want to use that as a way of, that metaphor as a way of introducing this particular story, which ran last week on The Guardian. It would have been the top headline had the Queen not died that day. And this is an example of the kind of story I think we really need to see in the South African media more often. It might read initially like a sort of weird, obscure science story, but it's a story that has a very profound set of implications for humanity, and which about the changes that will be with us long past the Queen and all her successors. So, and really the key points that came out of the story are that tipping points, which are natural systems that are destabilized by the human influence on the climate, are starting to threaten to be triggered. And these include the collapse of Greenland's ice cap, which would eventually produce huge amounts of sea level rise, the collapse of key currents in the North Atlantic Ocean, which produce a stable climate for much of Northern Europe and Northern European agriculture. And another potential tipping point is the melting of carbon-rich permafrost in the Arctic. And what that means is that carbon, which has been locked away naturally in the permafrost, will then be released in addition to the human contribution to climate change, accelerating the climate crisis. This is what these predictions mean for Europe. This is a UK Met Office chart. The yellow line that you see there are their predictions from 2003 for temperature change in Europe. And what the black line is the actual observed temperatures. So you can see that those predictions have been very, very solid indeed. So this is a very fast growing crisis. Climate change is coming at us very, very fast. It's not something linear and orderly and predictable, quite the contrary. These are how these changes are unfolding in South Africa. And at the moment, on current emissions and temperature trends, we're on track to warm by 5 to 6 degrees in the century in many regions. So I invite you to imagine how this graph would unfold in South Africa if it followed the similar trends to those in Europe. And unfortunately, the warming trend in South Africa is much steeper. So governments aren't obviously acting nearly fast enough to arrest this climate crisis. Why is that? I think part of the problem is a democratic disconnect. So many of our major economies, such as the US, the UK, South Africa, are flawed or close to flawed democracies in which the voice of the people often doesn't turn into policy. We often have ignorance of the modern reality of uneconomic growth, that many of the ways in which we're growing economically are actually doing more damage than they are bringing benefits. We have policy makers who are often ignorant of climate change and can't imagine a world without fossil fuels, which and we have a lack of appreciation for the alternatives to the use of fossil fuels. And then, of course, the focus of our divestment campaign, there is very widespread denial and corruption directly funded by fossil fuel companies. And in South Africa, this amounts to a widespread public ignorance of the nature of the climate crisis. So we can see this in the gulf between two reports. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2021, respondents to that report, global policymakers and key business people, overwhelmingly rank climate action failure as being the leading risk facing the world over a 2 to 10 year time horizon. But in South Africa, only 20% of South Africans even understand that the climate crisis is being caused by human action. So, as the UN Secretary General says, we seem to be trapped in a world where fossil fuel producers and companies have humanity by the throat. For decades, the fossil fuel industry invested heavily in pseudoscience and public relations with a false narrative to minimize their responsibility for climate change. Because, of course, the emissions from the fossil fuel industry remain the leading cause of global climate change. So this all adds up to some key myths and assumptions that I think are pervasive in South Africa. For example, the idea that protecting the environment is an expensive luxury, whereas the environment is in fact the only real foundation for our economy and for our society. The myth that climate change will be slow and predictable and we still have time to fix it. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned, it's disorderly and accelerating, and to fix it, or to at least slow it to the degree that we need to have very dramatic emissions cuts of greenhouse gases of 50% by 2030. Another myth is not necessarily a myth, but a kind of distorted assumption is this notion of net zero by 2050. Unfortunately, a lot of the net zero plans put out real emissions cuts far too late. And as I've just mentioned, we need to have those emissions cuts in this decade. And if we get that 50%, then the rest will largely take care of it itself. And then in South Africa, I think another key myth is the idea that our people are poor, and which of course many people are, and they need the jobs from the fossil fuel industry. Unfortunately, the emissions of the fossil fuel industry also destroyed jobs around the world. We're talking about an extractive economic model that has been failing us for far too long in South Africa, and it's not going to suddenly fix our very real problems of poverty and inequality now. And then another key myth, I think, is the idea that developing countries can act later, that there's some benefit to still sticking with fossil fuels, that time is now past as well. Unfortunately, despite their rhetoric, the world's largest oil and gas companies are failing to back their words and pledges on climate change, and they're still spending an enormous amount of money on lobbying and distorting the climate debate. To go back to the damage that's caused by fossil fuels, just to give one example very close to home, Sasol, if you look at the social cost of carbon, that's the damage done by a single ton of carbon when added to the atmosphere. The gulf between Sasol's earnings is absolutely, and the amount of damage done by their emissions is absolutely staggering. So in 2018, for example, we see they had 10 billion in earnings and did 3 trillion rands worth of damage to the global climate. These numbers are almost impossible to believe, but they are well-founded. So the guide that I'm going to run through in a moment was written by myself and my colleague Joanne Smitheram. We are journalists who have worked in South Africa for a combined 40 years. We intend this to make a constructive and helpful contribution to human rights journalism, really. And that says, which should bring us back to our responsibilities in the media, should refer always, I think, to our National Bill of Rights and the right to have an environment that is not harmful to our health and or well-being, and that is preserved for future generations. I think another touchstone for us in this work should be the South African Press Code of Conduct, which says that the media exists to serve society, that news should be presented in context and without material omissions, to make some key points from that code relating to this work. So getting climate journalism right, I think, is a balance of some 4 key factors. Firstly, having accurate content that reflect the facts and qualified expert opinion, having accurate context ensuring that the climate issue is reported in stories of natural disasters, in stories on agriculture and fossil fuels, for example, wherever there is a potential role for climate, even if we don't necessarily understand exactly what that role is, that role should be noted. We need appropriate editorial presentation. All too often, still climate stories are reported on, which is great, but then they're pushed into particular silos, put away in environment sections, and don't nearly often enough make it into the headlines. And then, is there enough content? I think Extinction Rebellion, with a protest earlier this year, captured that issue in the slogan, "Climate News Every Day." So I'm going to move now to the climate reporting guide itself and run you through that very quickly. So we talk about what South Africans need to know about the climate crisis, the problems and the opportunities, the causes of climate change. I think all too many people don't know the basic mechanisms of climate change yet. We talk about the climate crisis in South Africa, the particular impacts that we're seeing here. And we talk about our South African climate energy challenge, the challenge that comes with being one of the world's most fossil fuel intensive economies. We talk about the issue of whether we can still play catch up on the back of fossil fuels or whether the time for that has passed. And we talk about the just transition and the issues of jobs. And then onto renewable energy, whether it's a viable and potential replacement for our energy needs here in South Africa, and the potential to replace coal, and the different paths and options that we have. Then we go down to, that's the context for climate journalism in South Africa. Then we go to some specific suggestions for climate journalism in particular. So again, coming back to this issue of foregrounding the background. I think as journalists and editors, we need to go out of our way to look for climate news and bring it into the foreground and make sure that it gets a higher level of coverage. We need to look at the terminology that we use. Climate change often suggests that climate change is neutral or benign. We need to talk about climate emergency and climate crisis far more often. Natural disaster reporting and reporting on the fossil fuel industry always needs to mention the climate context, even if we're not entirely certain what that precise context might be yet. And then we should need to think imaginatively about integrating, for example, the climate context into weather reporting, like numbers such as the current global temperature increase, regional temperature increases can be reported alongside weather reports. We've got a case study on best practice from The Guardian, which started their climate journey in 2015 by actually divesting from fossil fuels, really taking responsibility there. And then we look at the flip side of some of these recommendations, some of the errors that are still happening sometimes in our media. We then have a set of potential contacts for journalists to contact from civil society, from universities to talk to, and economies who are well versed in the climate issue. And we also have a section called the deeper stories, looking at the underlying causes of and solutions for climate change. So obviously, the leading cause of climate change is our fossil fuel dominated energy system, but there are also other subsidiary causes, our extractive agricultural model, toxic social dynamics, tattered democracies, a profit-led financial services sector. All these issues are unpacked here, and we offer way of looking beyond the headline solutions to some of the deeper solutions. Here is our section.
That you're on 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. I'll wrap in a moment. Climate journalism resources, an extensive list here. Here are the tables with the lists of contacts, including economists who are well versed in climate change. And lastly, since we're fossil-free South Africa, a section on divestment. So what's next? Please, we'll mention this again at the end, but send us feedback on the guide. If you want us to present on these issues to your colleagues or to students, please get in touch. Look at the guide, sign up to our Climate Beat newsletter, and watch the space. We're just getting started with this work. Thank you all very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. There's a request in the chat for us to share the slides, and I do believe we would share them with everyone who's registered. So that will be done. And just to say, it's always sobering listening to you talking on climate change, David. It always kind of brings it into stark focus. So thank you for that. And yeah, great work on the guide itself. And I hope everyone will give feedback and use the guide as well. All of our esteemed colleagues in the media that have joined us here today.